Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So this video is a vindication of the British Raj in India. It is a vast topic. I can scarcely scratch the surface in just a few minutes because obviously India's a gigantic country, one population, certainly these days, very big in area. And it's a long time period that I'll be talking about. So that I'm going to argue that on the whole it was good. I certainly acknowledge that there were some aspects were bad, occasionally very bad, and I'm trying to do this objectively, but I do have an opinion. So I try to be unemotional about it, and it's very difficult to detach oneself. I realise these are sensitive issues for many people, and I presume it's principally Indians who'll be watching this video. One thing I want to get away from is some sort of national slanging match. Think that if you say the British Raj was good, that you're degrading India, or if you say it was bad, that you're demeaning the United Kingdom, and that shouldn't be the way. Unfortunately, many people approach it that way and try and bombard each other with insults. There are many Britons who take the Indian nationalist view, who think that the British Raj was overall bad, sometimes dreadful. Not many Indians take the opposite view, but I don't want to fall victim to just following doxa. Now, simply because the majority of people subscribe to a viewpoint, that doesn't make it right or indeed wrong. So here we go. So I'm from Ireland, so that's part of the British Isles, not from the United Kingdom. I'm from the Republic of Ireland. So there's a danger that I could have a sentimental attachment to the British Isles, and I'm a citizen of the UK as well. So I try not to do that. I try to approach it as fair-mindedly as I can. Anyway, that's probably too much of a preface already. So anyway, we obviously know when the British Raj ended in 1947, 15th of August that year, but it existed in some form, well, I suppose from New Year's Eve 1600, when Elizabeth I gave a charter to the Honourable East India Company, as it then was. I know people take strenuous exception to the use of the word honourable in relation to that organisation, but that was part of its official name. I realise that many people regard it as being utterly dishonourable. So obviously it's a trading relation to begin with. Now, I hope most people watching this video will be aware the British Raj didn't come into being like that. It wasn't in a split second. Rome wasn't built in a day, but very gradually, starting off as a mercantile operation, just trading on the coast, first of all setting up a factory, as they called it, a surat, which wasn't a factory as we'd understand it in these days, gradually purchasing land and slowly, oh so slowly, moving further into the hinterland. I wish I could remember who said that it was the British Empire was created in a fit of absence of mind, because there was no grand plan at the beginning. So there's some trading posts and gradually buying more land. There was no police force as such. The Mughal Empire was there, which had invaded India by way of Afghanistan. They're originally Mongols, a Muslim empire with their capital at Delhi. Of course, the majority of people in India were still Hindus. The Muslims would say 30%. But anyway, through myriad stages, the East India Company established itself as the chief power in India by the mid-18th century. Obviously, the French East India Company was there. The Danish East India Company, the Nederlands Compagnie van de Verre Oost was there as well, or Verenigde Oost-India Company, Indisch Company was there, mainly in Indonesia, but a tiny bit on the coast of India. But when we said the East Indies in those days, referring not just to what's now India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, but even to like Malaysia, Singapore, anywhere in that region. So the British Raj, as such, directly under the UK government, came in 1857, but dissolved in 1947. Anyway, so the British Raj is so often denigrated, and obviously it deserves robust criticism because millions of people served it, maybe tens of millions over the time that it existed, mostly Indians, some British people as well. So will there be some bad eggs amongst those tens of millions of people? Yeah, certainly. Were they bad British people? Definitely. Today, yeah, there are definitely. You'll find them in every nationality. Does Britain have more than its fair share? I don't think so. I could be wrong. Maybe it's got an unusually high proportion of psychopaths or malevolent people. So it's often taken as axiomatic that the British Raj is a bad thing. The British Raj gets a very bad press. They say that winners write history, and obviously the Indian independence movement were the victors, So it wouldn't be surprising if their narrative is the one that people principally hear. So writers, historians, commentators, journalists, opinion formers of all kinds, particularly those of a liberal or left hue, are inclined to disparage the British Raj. It can't go wrong. Put it this way, Indians are inclined to think it's a bad thing. There are 1.4 billion Indians in the world, about 70 million Britons, and so, the India outnumbers the UK 20-1. India's obviously increasingly wealthy, got great clout, about to be the most populous nation in the world, a nuclear power and all that. Out of self-interest, it would seem much better to say what Indians generally like. And Britons, I haven't seen an opinion poll this, but I would guess only half Britons have a positive opinion of the British Raj overall. So it's often castigated in the purplest of prose. So it's associated with racialism, oppression, with tyranny, exploitation, slavery, and it's even been accused of genocide. So some of these attacks are not entirely without foundation, but the criticisms are often levelled with undue vehemence, without objectivity occasionally, without falsehood, with decontextualization, not making sufficient allowances for the era, especially if we go back as far back as, say, 1600. So there are some Indians who are incredibly mettlesome and wise enough, have the moral courage to disagree, and have done a little bit to redress the balance, such as the legendary Nirad C. Chowdhury. I so wish I'd met him. I was actually in India when he died. I must find his house in Oxford and make a video about it there. And his autobiography of an unknown Indian was published in 1951, very shortly after the termination of the British Raj, and he was sacked from his job at All India Radio. So much for the freedom of expression in independent India. And I was reading the Indian Constitution only this evening, which guarantees liberty of expression to all Indians, and obviously that's very much under threat from the Modi administration. Well, perhaps I shouldn't put my cards on the table, but I'll hazard it anyway, because for my money, the goodies in Indian politics are Congress now of the two major parties. Like Deepak Lal did the world a great service by publishing his book in Praise of Empires. I think his uncle had been mayor of Delhi as well. It doesn't restrict himself to the British Empire, so it's a very worthy tome that adds much to the historiographical debate. And I'm sure you've seen Dr. Tharoor's barnstorming speech, his rodomontade, in which he attempts to skewer the British Empire, knowing every barb he delivers against the Raj will add another 10,000 to his majority back in Thiruvatanapuram. Now, that doesn't mean why it's doing it. I think it is. I mean, just you try coming out as an imperialist in India, and I don't think you get terribly far in your political career. But I'm rash enough to express unpopular views. I know that I'm not standing for politics in India. So in the United Kingdom, Professor Niall Ferguson, he wrote this book, Empire, which includes a large section on India, and he includes a positive case for the British Raj. I don't think it's a partisan one, and obviously he is fair-minded, goes out of his way to mention things which would be unhelpful to the case that he wishes to lay out. But anti-imperial polemicists are seldom so restrained or fair-minded. They're not tempted to be, got to be even-handed about this. There's, of course, a reasonable case to be made by neutralists, and the task of a historian is not to take sides. Perhaps it's puerile to try and divide the world into goodies and baddies, especially looking back centuries. I know I just said the Congress are the good guys, but that's about certain political issues which I think are relevant, and I'm judging the 21st century by 21st century standards. And here they're holding India to its own avowed standards in terms of freedom of expression and pluralism. But anyway, historians ought to look for causation and consequence. They're not moral philosophers. And if you try to become emotionally involved, trying to exculpate one side, to magnify the other, to incriminate some historical actors, to defame people, then it seems to me that you're being too partisan about it. You're losing your objectivity, and it's being unscholarly. But there's a view of some that you ought to engage with the issues and form a moral judgment. Norman Finkelstein says that rigorous scholarship is perfectly compatible with pushing an agenda and indeed a sense of moral outrage. Obviously, this sense of moral outrage can be used by those whose scholarship is spurious. But anyway, so the United Kingdom allows statues of Jawaharlal Nehru, Gandhi, and so on around the United Kingdom, plaques showing where various people lived to honour them. and I think there's even a Nehru Square in London. Nehru, when he was Prime Minister, was invited to the United Kingdom, and he was given the honour of the freedom of the City of London by the Lord Mayor of London. If the United Kingdom was so evil to his country only just a few years before, surely he wouldn't accept such a thing. And surely Congress, the party now, if they believe the British Raj was so monstrous, would say, well, we'll have to posthumously expel him for lowering himself to that. So India, by contrast, has dumped the statues of former governors and the former British monarchs, who were, of course, emperors of India. But this says about which government's been more mature and magnanimous about past disputes. And the thing is, obviously, if I criticise the government of India, that's certainly not a criticism of every Indian. And you can criticise the British government without being anti-British. You can excoriate it. I'm actually quite critical of the British government at times. So it's not a dispute between two countries. It's between various political ideas, movements, and okay, in India sometimes, well, by 1947 it was a majority movement. I don't think anyone disputes that by 1947 the majority of Indians wanted independence. So I want to have a more fair-minded approach, and I sometimes see these comments on the internet. How would you feel if your country was invaded and occupied and blah blah blah? Well, I'm not from Great Britain, but that did actually happen to Great Britain on a number of occasions. You could obviously say, well, by the ancient Romans, by the Anglo-Saxons. Now that's only part of Great Britain the Anglo-Saxons came into, by the Normans, which is obviously only Wales and England, not Scotland. Now with Ireland, it's debatable. We had several waves of invasion of various Celtic groups. The Anglo-Normans, it's debatable whether that's an invasion or not, and on and on. So yeah, I mean, it's happened. It's happened to virtually every country. Virtually every country has invaded others and has been invaded. So it's not that one can point the finger. And trying to be very objective about things, you say, well, people do what they do, and they try to gain an advantage for themselves. That's unsurprising. That's human nature, and there's not really much morality to it if we're looking back far enough and just putting aside these moral judgment, values-free history, some people say. I don't entirely subscribe to that, so I'll try to draw some judgments and sometimes be scathing about the British Raj. But no one gets exercised about what the Romans or the Anglo-Saxons did in Great Britain or in Ireland. We don't seem to care about the Firbolgs or the Cruthans, the Tuatha De Danann or the Gaels. They're all completely accepted, and this is about how things are skewed in an Irish nationalist narrative. It's only after 1169 that some people line and say it's dreadful these people are coming in. But it's undeniable that the Roman Empire launched wars of aggression without the slightest justification. They sacked cities, and after pillaging, people taking all their valuables, enslaved people, and obviously slaves could be raped, they could be killed for public entertainment, and in the Colosseum, and yet Rome is held up as having been highly civilized, despite providing such gory entertainment for its citizens, panem et circenses. So Roman proletarians kept amused by seeing ethnic minority people, religious minority people, torn apart by wild beasts. But there's much to be said for that horrid empire. Is held in high esteem to this day. Their contributions to science and engineering, their senatorial system, their cursus honorum, Latin literature, is appreciated by many. Their Roman roads, which lasted for millennia. But yeah, there were victims. We don't hear their voices because most of the people they conquered didn't have any writing, and the Romans didn't write from their perspective. And that's a fascinating observation, the way that civilization and savagery can coexist in the same nation and indeed in the same individual. Someone can have literary sensibility, be a very sophisticated person, a very humane person, someone with great gentility, and yet be sadistically cruel to others. So the Roman Empire was an invader of Britannia and indeed invented Great Britain as a concept. So it did a lot of good. So nobody bears a grudge about that one, as the wickedness of these Roman empires. People aren't emotive about that because it's so long ago. So I wonder if India in 2 millennia to come will take a similarly detached view of the British Raj. So people are able to see that the Roman Empire did a great deal of good for Britain, and obviously there were people who got killed during the invasion, there were people who were enslaved, obviously most people were enslaved, so yeah, there were certainly victims. People were killed defending their homelands from the invaders and were taken into servitude. So people in Great Britain are mostly objective and wise about looking at that. I know it's more difficult in the immediate aftermath of the event, and obviously the British Raj is within living memory. So the British Raj was not established by conquest on the whole. It was over many stages. From, as I say, arriving in 1600 is only shortly before 1900 that the full extent of it was achieved, as in the northwest frontier in Pakistan, the Durand line, as in the frontier between Pakistan and Afghanistan, was drawn only shortly before that, named after the Britisher Mr. Durand who drew it. So anyway, so it was often by agreement by Indian princes signing treaties, or indeed by purchase. Sometimes it was invasion. The British Raj, for half its life, was against slavery, much to the consternation of some Indian nationalists. Princely states he didn't want to abolish slavery. So the British Raj didn't go in for this barbaric human sacrifice for public entertainment that the Roman Empire did. Now, okay, that was many centuries before, so you might say, well, you'd have to expect them to be worse, the moral standards to be lower. There's this teleological view of history. The history necessarily moves forward, and it doesn't actually, it can go backwards. And that's one of the things is, don't imagine that I feel any disrespect for India. I have the uttermost admiration for Indian civilization, which I realize is very ancient, goes back 4,500 years. And I wouldn't say this about every country which is an erstwhile British colony. So there were times when India was light years ahead of Ireland and Great Britain, having writing much sooner, having far greater knowledge in mathematics and the sciences, being more humane, the Emperor Ashoka abolishing slavery and so forth. Obviously, it was subsequently brought back. I wish that Ireland and Great Britain had been conquered by India 1,000 years ago. That would have helped us a lot. And Indians were superior in many ways back then. Obviously, the British Raj put an end to some grisly customs in India. They say that just occasionally human sacrifice goes on in India today. I do mean very, very rarely, out of a country of 1.4 billion. I know it's totally illegal, and the great majority of idiots would be as horrified by that as I am. If there's a comparison between the Roman Empire and the British Raj, there's no doubt that the British Raj wins a beauty contest. You might say, well, of course it would do because it's later on. But as I said, history doesn't necessarily move forward, or sometimes moves backwards. I know Obama said, well, I know it goes backwards sometimes, but it's an arc which bends towards freedom. We can't assume that. You can have someone like Germany who was very civilized in 1933 and became really barbaric within 10 years. Okay, I hope that people in India could examine the British Raj in a more dispassionate manner. And obviously, British people shouldn't approach it through tinctured nationalistic spectacles. They've got to be willing to believe that their country stood for bad sometimes. And the United Kingdom has certainly done evil things sometimes, like the transatlantic slavery. That slave trade was just abominable, extraordinarily cruel. And Britain really was a villain in doing that. And the United Kingdom has been on the unrighteous side in wars, sometimes been the aggressor. So we're trying to see the British Raj as a product of its time. Anyway, we think our ethical expectations, are a bit higher in modern times. But nobody in his right mind, I think, looks back to the Roman Britain and says, well, the ancient Britons were the goodies and the Romans were the baddies. And we actually don't know how bad it was in ancient Britain because they didn't have written sources. Only what the Romans tell us, that they had human sacrifice. Did they have slavery? Almost certainly. I mean, so far as I know, every country in the world had slavery at some point. It's only in the early 19th century people started abolishing, and it stayed abolished. The Danes abolishing it, first of all. Okay, admittedly in Western Europe, people didn't enslave each other totally by the late 19th century, by the late 18th century, but they had serfdom, semi-slavery. And obviously the British Empire being the second one ever to abolish it and put a great deal of effort into suppressing the slave trade everywhere, from 1834 being phased out. Anyway, so you have to have objectivity when looking through a great distance of hindsight, and see that, as I say, that Britain is a Roman invention. Ancient Britons didn't regard themselves as Britons till they were defined from the outside. Now, this analogy with Roman Britain obviously is not completely applicable to India. everything I say about Rome and Britain isn't necessarily true of India. So Britons perceive themselves as being Iceni or Brigantes and so on, and some of them in the north, especially Caledonia, Props never saw themselves as Britons. Most of that wasn't conquered by the Romans. But anyway, to some extent that would have been true with 18th century India. Obviously, I know India is a very ancient country. Yes, it's been united. The Indian state is weakened, lost control of the margins, kind of fallen apart, been recreated a number of times in its very long history. And people can often be defined from the outside. And it's true that the notion of India predated any contact with Britons by centuries. So the idea was not so strong that it couldn't be somewhat refashioned as British India. The boundaries of India were vague, and no nation is eternal. Nations are man-made. We have it in us to unite two different countries, to divide them up. There's no universally agreed definition of what a nation is. It's debatable. So these boundaries were vague in the extreme until settled by the British Raj. And the boundaries of India and Pakistan are still contested with regard to Jammu and Kashmir. Or remember, in my guidebook of India, there's always a bit inserted saying, the boundaries of India have not been checked and may not be correct, as in case India wants to claim more land from China. And that's one thing is the Republic of India often rejecting its British heritage in some areas, but certainly wants to accept those boundaries, those British-era boundaries with China. Don't let the Chinese have more. And so let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, assume that everything is bad. And one of the key things there is justice, that a lot of British-era legislation is still on the statute book. If it was so unjust, the system of justice wouldn't be largely the same. Yes, some new laws have been introduced. Yes, some old laws have been repealed. But the overall architecture is the same, and often, say, citing decisions from England. Now, in English courts, I presume people can cite cases from India. I'm not aware of any that are, but I'm not a lawyer. So you take a very hard-hearted anti-imperialist not to recognise there were at least a few good aspects to the British Raj. In anti-imperialist discourse, these achievements are diminished and said to be negated by the ghastly aspects of the British Raj. So in this talk, I wish to produce a corrective to some of the extraordinarily unfair treatment of the British Raj in so much public writing and speaking. So Jawaharlal Nehru, Gandhi, and many of the most prominent Indian nationalist leaders all publicly acknowledged there was at least a little bit good about the British Empire, and it was more benign than its rivals. So Indian nationalists were often fulsome in their praise of the empire until the close of the First World War. George Orwell, who was a British socialist born in India, an outspoken advocate of Indian independence, when he was in Burma as a police officer, and in shooting an elephant, he said, "I know this. The British Raj is far better than any of the younger empires which are struggling to supplant it." He wrote this before 1933, as in the Nazis were in office in Germany. Perhaps he's alluding to Japan, the Soviet Union. So this essay should not be the flip side of the prejudices of anti-imperialists. I don't want to be selective in examining only the positive bits of the empire. As I say, I've gone out of my way to say there were terrible things were done, like the Amritsar massacre. That's Jallianwala Bagh. So that's not to say that an anti-imperialist can't be fair and honest. You could be an objective person. Can you be an objective and form an opinion? I think you can. That very few intelligent people have no opinions whatsoever, especially about a topic that they find scintillating, because they've given it a great deal of thought. But it's like the more I know, the less sure I am, because I see the situation in the round. I have more knowledge. So this also implies to those of an imperialist outlook. You can still be fair-minded, you can still be an objective person and come to an imperialist view. You probably wouldn't be very categorical about it if you are well-informed. So I don't want this to be crassly polemic. And so much of what is written and said on this is diatribe, like the good Dr. Thoreau, point scoring, playing to the gallery. It may be sincere in what he's saying. Anyway, so why does the British Raj not enjoy a good reputation? Well, as I said, the victors write history, and it should be asked why so many people in India are critical of the British Raj, and indeed there are obviously valid criticisms to be levelled at it. I went to India on 3 extended visits, spent about 6 months there, and I anticipated negativity towards the British Raj, but it was a level which surpassed what I had expected. So a blatant Indian nationalist answer would be say that because the British Raj is so bad. So don't feel if you're Indian you have to think it was bad, or indeed you have to think it was good. If you're British, you don't have to think that it was good, or indeed that it was bad. So try not to be guided by nationality. But there are other possible explanations why the majority of Indian people think that the British Raj was wicked. So life in India since independence has not been a bed of roses. Obviously, India's achieved a great deal of success, especially in the last couple of decades. With very healthy economic growth. Incidentally, another thing that amused me was seeing, obviously, the Indian constitution that defines a country as socialist. We, the Indian people, blah, 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 want this democratic socialist republic, all the rest of it. But I know this was passed, but the Indian people really want socialism? Certainly some did. It was very popular in the 1940s. And even in the 90s, the Congress Party said they stood for socialism. But there were real socialist parties as well, communist parties in various states like West Bengal and Kerala. But they didn't confiscate all private property. I don't know why they call themselves communists, but I mean, perhaps that word ought to be deleted, because I don't think that many Indians believe in socialism, and it's achieved a lot as a more capitalist society, and I don't think socialism is all bad. But anyway, there's been some very healthy economic growth for the past 20 years. So there are some good things about independence, but would that have happened anyway? We can play some counterfactuals. I might talk a bit later about some of the problems that independence caused. So there are some intractable problems that India struggles with manfully, like any country does. Could it be the politicians at the moment would like to divert attention from their own shortcomings, their own peculation, their own self-interest, their own mendacity, by pointing the finger at the United Kingdom? Now the British Raj is not there. In a way, can't really answer back. I mean, the UK is not really interested in defending its colonial records. A long time ago, India's never going to be a colony of the UK again. In fact, as I predicted elsewhere, the United Kingdom shall be a colony of India. So they want to misdirect people, divert attention from their own misdeeds by focusing public fury on what they perceive as a defeated enemy. There's partly that, because they know this will go down well, scapegoating the UK. And obviously for bad things that happened before 1947, the United Kingdom is to blame to some extent. Before 1957, a bit less so. Yes, there was East India Company, but London had limited control. The East India Company did its own thing. I mean, if you go right back to 1600, yes, Elizabeth I had given a charter, but to sail from England, and it was England and Wales, not Scotland, not Ireland at that stage, of all the East India Company, to sail from those countries to India was going to take the better part of a year. And then it was completely hands-off. They were a law unto themselves, because how long was it going to take a letter to get from Calcutta back to London, reply back, be about 2 years. So anyway, so India still has a significant population living in dire poverty. I don't want to be disparaging. Obviously, there are Indians who are super rich there, billionaires in dollars. There's some very wealthy people. There's a healthy middle class. So the working class doing quite well. But there's a significant number of people who are living in poverty. So they're like 20% illiteracy, which I know is much lower than the British Raj, because, yeah, the Indian economy has moved forward. The world has moved forward. Every country in the world is richer than it was in 1947, sometimes staggeringly richer. Look at South Korea, which was on about a par with India in 1947. Look how rich they are. And I did notice that, I can't remember the statistics exactly, say in the Second World War, that the British Army were paid 4 times more than the Indian Army. Many Indians said it was unfair, partly based on the cost of living in the two countries. Or you signed up for this. If you don't accept the salary, don't take the job. Nevertheless, it was the largest volunteer army ever raised, and that's true to this day, especially bearing in mind, of course, that the world population now is about 3 times higher than it was in 1947. Anyway, but these days, the British Army salaries, I think I'm right in saying, 10 times higher than an Indian Army salary. So the wealth gap has widened, not shrunk. And if the British Raj was so terrible and Indian independence was so wonderful, you think that the gap would shrink. Anyway, so corruption is widespread in India. I'm not saying that every Indian politician or police officer is corrupt. No, that'd be unfair. Is there corruption in the UK? Yeah, sure, there is. We know there's a lot of corruption in India because lots of Indian politicians and journalists say so, and there are many exposés caught. So Indian security forces are battling separatists and communist terrorists in several regions, Naxalites, hardly ever reported in the West, actually. Very little is heard about this outside India. So India is so large, it's often in remote regions where not as many people speak English, so the international media doesn't get into it. So the conduct of the Indian police and the military is normally honourable. However, of course, there are a few incidents in which some Indian police officers or military personnel disgrace the uniform that they wear through brutality. So I'm absolutely not saying that characterises the Indian security forces as a whole, but through torture and through the unlawful killing of unarmed persons. So you'll get this in any security force, unfortunately. It's a question of extent and what's done about it. And yes, India does sometimes take action against people who've committed these crimes, even members of the security forces. So if you have to battle a rebellion, does that mean you're wrong? No, it doesn't. A counterinsurgency can be legitimate. I actually do take the side of the government of India on this and say, yeah, sure, a sovereign state is absolutely entitled to repress a rebellion. Some Indian politicians like to fend off criticism from abroad, whether it's fair or unfair, by calling it neo-colonialist. So you can justify your position by harping on about the supposed wickedry of colonialism, and it's easier for India to forge alliances with countries such as the People's Republic of China by citing their common opposition to colonialism and indeed neo-colonialism. But colonialism is just used to mean anything I don't like. India often gratingly asserts its moral superiority in human rights, and indeed its human rights record is impressive, is the best in the region by quite a long way. This is one of the things I really respect about the Republic of India. You can get a fair trial there. I mean, despite what Modi's done, there's got a lot of free speech there. There are fair elections with genuine results. Even those who have defeated elections seldom say that these are bogus elections, and you certainly wouldn't say that about Pakistan. So India's obviously going to be the next superpower. As America's time in the sun may be coming to an end, who would I want as a world superpower? Obviously France and the UK never going to be superpowers again. China, no, thank you, a very oppressive government. India would be far preferable. So their ethnic, religious and caste asperities exist to this day. I'm not suggesting there's enmity between everyone of different ethnicities or between all Muslims and all Hindus. They hate each other. No, that's not true, or even the majority of either, but there's a bit of it. Inter-caste violence. Again, I'm not suggesting that all Brahmins despise all Sudras and so forth, or vice versa, but there's some of that. I know it can be overstated, and it's been reduced. And of course, there are many Indians who loathe this sort of communalist prejudice as much as I do. But these things can sometimes turn violent. So much anti-imperialist invective finds it into explanations for why such enmity exists, as though society can be riven because of the machinations, these British wire pullers behind the curtain controlling it all, divide and rule, which is twaddle. I've never come across a single speech or a single document by any British politician, administrator, police officer, soldier, who ever said anything about divide and rule, whether in those words or other words. So there's so many articles about this. I remember reading the Cambridge History of India, and there were so many nakedly partisan articles about that. And imperialists very seldom go in for that. Well, it's the love that dare not speak its name. None of people are willing to come out and say, yeah, sure, I am an imperialist. So anyway, the British Raj came to a close, and the Republic of India was erected in room of it. So the British Raj, in a sense, is no longer around to defend its good name. There's not much mileage in that because is dead and buried, and quicklime poured on top. Whereas, as I say, India is rising to a position of preeminence. So Indian politicians who participated in the campaign for independence see it as worthwhile talking up what they did and talking down what had gone before. So if post-independence India had compared unfavourably with the British Raj, then that wouldn't look good for the politicians who'd governed subsequent to 1947. So for the UK, there is no particular advantage in saying, no, the British Raj was quite good. The Republic of India is there now. It's not going to become British governed territory again. So if the UK wants to do business with India and maybe ally with India against China as it grows mightier, and more menacing, it pays to cozy up to India and just tell the Indians what they'd like to hear. There's little to be gained, as I say, by advocating for this for a lost cause and thereby provoking the ire of many people in Hindustan. So that's why people are choosing to curry favour with the country, pun intended. So there are political parties which grew out of the Quit India movement. Well, obviously Indian National Congress, tracing its history back to 1885. There's no political party around which traces its legacy to being against Indian independence. There was a Liberal Party in India, which fascinatingly were led by Dr. Annie Besant, which was actually against independence, wanted some degree of self-governance, but I presume they dissolved. So there are no political parties expressing the countervailing point of view in the UK, sorry, not in the UK, in India. And in democracy, that's a shame. Both sides of the debate should be heard, but you get to the stage where one viewpoint's got a critical mass, and you're just not going to win an election if you express the unpopular viewpoint. It was wound up after independence, I believe. There was also an Indian Loyalist Association. I remember reading one of Martin Gilbert's biographies of Churchill, well, his multi-volume biography. And one of those tomes I found out about is some judge in Bombay who was in it, Mumbai as it is now. But I'd love to find out more about that organisation. I often fantasize whether a few brave souls loyally meet, 2 or 3 in an upper room dedicated to that cause, which will never be revived. So in education and discourse, in India, there's a great deal about those who participated in the campaign to bring the British Raj to an end, and they're held up as paragons of virtue. They're role models for the youth, and they achieved their goal since the liquidation of the British Raj was achieved within only about 17 years of that objective being stated by Congress. They're accorded the title Freedom Fighter, which is a value judgment. There are statues of leaders of Congress and the Indian National Army in many cities. I've seen them, and I've seen statues of Subhas Chandra Bose, well, one in Delhi. Indeed, it was unveiled by Indira Gandhi. So Gandhi is on the money. I'm talking about Mohandas Karamchand. I shudder to call him Mahatma. So not surprisingly, many folk in India have been brought up to revere these figures, and therefore they dislike the system that these figures brought down. So children are indoctrinated to admire Congress and the INA leaders. So education here is obviously not being objective and even-handed on this, and I have looked into a few Indian school textbooks. There's a lot of nationalistic myth-making about the British Raj amongst Indians. The films are set out to villainize the Raj, suggest that pro-Raj Indians are turncoats and Judases, and of course to idolize anti-Raj fighters. One such example is the film Lagan. The film invents a wholly imaginary scenario about an excessive tax bill, but it'll be written off if they can win a cricket match. So this wager. Anyway, I'm not sure it'd be allowed in India today, a cricket match, to have your tax forgiven. But for some people, tax evasion is a national sport. Now, I loathe tax and do everything I legally can to minimize my liability. And I know, obviously, the government of India has great difficulty collecting taxation. And that's another thing, actually. Gambling is illegal in India. Well, doesn't that take away people's freedom? But all right, it's arguable, governments can set regulations around this. Should we be allowed to have wagers or not? And the UK banned certain forms of gambling in the past. There's a film, Mangal Pandey, about the Indian Mutiny of 1857. Most Indians prefer to call it the First War of National Liberation. So Mangal Pandey is a mutineer to be executed. Can we call him a mutineer? Well, he voluntarily joined the army of the East India Company. He took that oath of loyalty, and he broke that oath. I mean, that is mutiny. You might think that mutiny is morally justified in this case, but there's no question that it is mutiny. Obviously the Indian Army would take a dim view of mutinies today. Anyway, it shows him saving the life of a British officer when he was a loyal sepoy. He's shown going to a brothel, which is meant to be a blemish on his character. Some people were up in arms about this. I think the very first Indian to be killed in the mutiny was Pandey. So Mangal Pandey, I think, is semi-based on a real figure. But I think a lot of this is actually invented for the film. Apart from the mutineers, they're shown as morally upstanding, and the British, of course, are shown as devils. So often they're demonized. Some British are shown wisely advising against provoking the Indians over their religious sensibilities. That's about as good as the British get in this film. Anyway, at a conference several years ago with British teachers, well, it was about 10 years ago, there were several teachers with most shockingly left-wing prejudices. You might think that my views are horrifically right-wing, but you could be a left-wing imperialist. Anyway, they blackguarded the British Empire, which was quite shocking in its bigotry. they gave a classic analogy that you wouldn't ask a wife beater to tell you about himself. You'd ask his wife what he was really like. Of course, the wife stood for the colonies and the wife beater stood for the United Kingdom during the imperial epoch. And now it's ironic that they should have chosen that example, because stopping the mistreatment of women was one of the noblest accomplishments of the British Raj, but unfortunately wasn't wholly successful. Banning sati, for example, banning obviously people being sold, particularly women, outlawing female infanticide. And of course, there's some Indians who were aghast at such practices. Now, I know what you might say. Sati was only amongst Hindus. It wasn't among all Hindus. It was only in certain areas of India. So it was by no means every widow who was killed like this. All right, it could be exaggerated. Nevertheless, nobody doubts that it happened. Okay, and by the 1830s, when it was outlawed, only a few hundred women per year were being killed in that way out of a population of perhaps 150 million. But a few hundred is obviously still too many, and it's indicative of a wider misogynistic trend in Indian life. And I know that India, to this day, struggles to make sure that women are fairly treated, particularly elderly women, widows, and so on. This is not trying to say that all Indians or most Indians are bad or were bad at the time. No. Or indeed that most British people are good even today or were good long ago. No. But pointing out one of the civilization advances which the British Raj achieved. And if you think British Raj was all bad, why don't you legalize sati? You'd have to admit that that was a step forward. Why not reintroduce slavery? So the British Raj wasn't all bad. Anyway, so there are glories of Indian civilization. And as I said, this talk is in no way anti-Indian. I'm not denigrating India. So India was, at many points, a marvelously advanced and impressive civilization. Some stages, perhaps the most sophisticated civilization in the world. Indian literature produced many marvels, such as the Bhagavad Gita and the Ramayana, and I've only dipped into these things in translation, so I stand in bewildered awe of India's manifold accomplishments, and I don't have any facility in any Indian language, so I can really just touch the outside of them. I can't judge their literary merit in the original tongue. So India's made many all-striking contributions to philosophy, and who can forget the Kama Sutra, obviously inventing modern mathematics and the concept of zero, without which Europeans wouldn't have made many scientific advances or done anything in terms of technology or engineering. But this came to Europe by way of the Arab world, so many Occidentals have laboured under the misapprehension that maths came from Arabia. You notice the way that Arabic is from right to left, but their numbers are from left to right. And most certainly most North Indian languages, Hindi, Punjabi, Bengali, are left to right. So Trevor Phillips, this British left-winger, he's one of those who made that mistake, thought that this sort of number system originally came from the Arab world. It didn't. It's not the Ishmaelites, it's the Indians invented it. So anyway, so scientific discoveries in India, or shampoo and things like that. So India produced things well ahead of anything in the West for a long time, or in terms of astronomy ahead of the West. So India was ruled by powerful dynasties that created a Pax Indiana, extended into Afghanistan at some times. But was that aggression, attacking Afghanistan, conquering it? And how were states created? I mean, you could go back to the Mughal Empire. That was created by force. And the previous Muslim dynasty, Delhi, they ruled by force. Or going back to Ashoka or even earlier Indian empires, they created their states by force. It was by conquest, which doesn't delegitimize them. Right, this national right of national self-determination is only 1918 that Woodrow Wilson propounded that, and other governments didn't accept it. Even many Americans didn't accept it. The United States didn't even ratify the Treaty of Versailles. So this idea that the people living in an area get to determine their future was a really new and contentious idea. And even today, India won't allow secession. We can't allow you to break away, because if we allow you to break away, they'll want to break away, and they'll want to break away. And before we know it, we'll have a moth-eaten India. We'll have no India left. But somehow this argument can't be applied to the British Raj, we're told. But anyway, this was something I wanted to touch on later. Once you start dividing a territory, it's very hard to stop. It just sets off a chain reaction of secession. But anyway, how did the British Raj come about? I remember M.K. Gandhi saying, and I wish I could find where the quotation comes from, "The English have not taken India, we've given it to them." Now, as an Irish unionist, I'm very aware that English and British are not the same thing. I'm British, I am not English. And that quotation from Gandhi was cited by Lord Bhikkhu Parekh, who's a British Indian Labour peer. So Gandhi allied English with British. It's a mistake that many Britishers make. So some peoples of history will imagine that the British Raj simply popped into being all at once, but it didn't come to existence suddenly. It was very gradually. Of course, establishing the Raj was an evolving process of almost 3 centuries. So what was I going to say? So the East India Company had a trading relationship with the Mughal Empire, purchased land off it, but paid to have Diwani, the right to govern Bengal and pay tribute, but then sometimes fought against the Mughal Empire. So it was the agreement of the Indian state. The Mughal Empire was the Indian state that it came there, the East India Company. So the Mughal Empire had been established not that long before, in the 1520s, with its capital at Delhi. The Mughals, well, I already described they are Mohammedans of Mongol origin, and so India was loosely defined. Its borders have waxed and waned the same as most states. So the Mughal Empire at its height approximated the territory of the modern-day Republic of India. The Mughal Empire never had the very south of India, what's now the Republic of India's territory, including Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. But it did have some land which doesn't belong to India, as in bits of what's now Pakistan. So obviously the Mughal subjects were mostly Hindu. The Mughal emperors, well, Shah Jahan, for example, was enlightened and saw that no religion had a monopoly on wisdom. It was an insight he shared with his British interlocutors. So he allowed people to practice their faith freely, promoted on merit. But there are other emperors or religious bigots like Aurangzeb, egged on by Islamists who discriminate against the Hindu majority, to pursue exclusionary policies, to preclude them from promotion, and to tax them more heavily than Muslims because they were dhimmis. So Aurangzeb was very unfair. Notably, Zia-ul-Haq, when he was the chief martial law administrator of Pakistan, perceived Aurangzeb as example as the one to emulate. Anyway, scores of Hindu temples were desecrated by Aurangzeb and demolished, and a masjid would be constructed in place of them. So there's the most notorious example at that Babur Masjid and Ayodhya, the first one being in Varanasi. So it was a highly tendentious issue in the 90s. Lal Krishna Advani wanting to go there, and loads of materials to a building brought there, and big court case played into the hands of Pakistan, of course. But my point is that not all sweetness is light was before the British Empire came along, and that stuff Aurangzeb and mistreating Hindus, the British didn't do that. They didn't encourage him to do that. The United Kingdom had absolutely nothing to do with that. So the idea that antipathy between different groups of Indians was a British invention is absolutely for the birds. And I'm not suggesting that Hindus and Muslims always hated each other or all of them felt this. No, sometimes there was happy cooperation, and that's splendid. That's the way it should be. And in fact, the Congress Party is perhaps the best example of that. So there was sometimes strife between Hindus and Muslims during the Raj, and it's so often been blamed on the British Raj. But I mean, I can't think of a single example where the British Raj ever encouraged this. It's important to note that this accusation is almost entirely without foundation. So all wasn't delightful between the two great faiths before the British arrived on the scene. Anyway, there's sometimes hatred and warfare between the two, but it's not my contention that one or other side was to blame. It varied between the different disputes, and sometimes, they're equally to blame. There's right and wrong on both sides. So the East India Company set up those factories. They were not manufacturing things despite the name, so they sold goods to people such as cloth, guns, and a few manufactured goods brought out from the British Isles, buying spices, ivory, diamonds, and drugs like opium. And opium was sold until the 1920s in the United Kingdom, as in India, as a recreational drug without any limitation. So some Indians say, oh, it's so bad they sold drugs to us. Well, they did, but the British sold to their own people too. And it's not like drugs were illegal in India prior to that, only banned under the British Raj in the 1920s. And many sadhus smoked cannabis, but somehow we're not told, oh, the Republic of India is drug dealing for allowing that. People say the drug dealing British Empire, sure, which it did. And as the world is moving towards decriminalisation, it would seem the British Raj was ahead of its time. I mean, should drugs be legalised or not? That's a sort of another debate. Anyway, so there was no police force in India or the British Isles at the time. Obviously, the Mughal Empire had an army, so the East India Company had to provide its own security in forms of an army, to which the Mughal Empire didn't object. As far as I know, no Indian ruler below him. So the East India Company rented land and eventually purchased land for its factories, and established more and more bases, trading posts further away from the coast. So anyway, the East India Company, well, there's a clue in the word company, it was actuated by profit, and in that end, it certainly succeeded. So it had shareholders in England to provide with dividends. So it's worth knowing that it was just an English and Welsh company until 1707. Then the Scots got in. There was even divide between the old company and the new company within England. So then there was an Act of Union, and the Scots were granted access to the East India Company. Irishmen, some of us became involved in the company in the late 18th century before we actually joined the United Kingdom. Obviously, after 1801, we were in it. So the East India Company's policy of not buying land initially changed quite soon. By the end of the 17th century, a lot of land was purchased, particularly around the river Hooghly, and that's Kolkata as it is now. So there's a temple there to the goddess of destruction, Kali, as in black in Hindi, because I always thought, oh, is it this white supremacist thing that we think anything negative is black? But then obviously Kali's name is black. Is she negative? But I know there's a very different Hindu view that actually destruction is essential to the life cycle, so no. Calicut or Calcutta, a British mispronunciation. So the company got this land in absolute sovereignty, as the Treaty of Cession said. But there's been no compensation paid by India to the United Kingdom for this, despite it being supposedly absolute sovereignty. But all right, the United Kingdom voluntarily ceded it in 1947, so there shouldn't be any compensation paid. So the British can't have been too oppressive. Why do people vote with their feet and move from Indian-ruled states to live in British-controlled cities like Kolkata, if it was so bad? Job Charnock of the East India Company founded Kolkata, and he met a Hindu widow under a banyan tree and dissuaded her from committing suicide in her husband's funeral pyre. He talked her out of it, and he wed her, because widows had a low status in Hinduism at the time, and obviously intermarriage between Britons and Indians was common back then. So the Mughal Empire began to decline with the death of Aurangzeb in 1707. Of course, it wasn't immediately blatant. The Mughals had a law of succession, and so when one emperor died, this appeared to be a free-for-all between many of his male relatives, and it was which dynasty would come out on top. So the emperor could be succeeded by his brother, older or younger, or his son, not necessarily the eldest, his cousin, his grandson, his nephew, and ideally it was the ablest who seized the reins of state. The system, if you can dignify it with that word, supposedly had the merit that at least a capable leader would win after this melee. But he didn't always come to the fore. Sometimes some of the courtiers, generals, and provincial governors would prefer a feeble emperor, easily manipulated or subject to blandishments, than a strong and independent-minded one. So the magnates did not wish to be controlled by a capable leader. They wanted a weakling. They wanted someone feeble-minded. They wanted to control him. Anyway, living emperors were sometimes overthrown. It said that grandfathers looked at their grandsons as allies against the mutual enemy, the intervening generation. So the Mughal Empire was plunged into war almost every generation. So don't think that pre-British India everything was delightful. No, there was no disorder. Which is not to say that British India was all magnificent too. So good and bad in every era. The Mughal Empire gradually grew weaker. Provincial governors and generals exploited the opportunity to hive off territory and form semi-independent or totally independent sections of the empire. And sometimes they were bold enough to declare outright sovereignty. So these Indian companies signed deals with various rulers. Indian provinces had such a wide variety of titles, like Raja, Maharaja, Rani if it's a woman, Nawab, Khan, Gaikwar, and Nizam, Begum, Shah. There's Zamindar, but that's more of a landowner. So many titles, but the generic prince was used. The French East India Company was there, as I mentioned. So the Portuguese had Diu, Daman, and Goa. Anyway, so there are tussles within these princely dynasties for the throne. The British Empire would sometimes back one candidate and the French another to the tussle. Whichever dynast came out on top, well, he would be like a vassal of the French or the British, and that's how France was created that way. Britain was created that way to some extent. So the British say, well, if our protege wins, you've got to trade with us to the exclusion of the French, and the French would do the same if they won. So in the 18th century, the East India Company gained more land, buying Diwani from the Mughal Empire, as I pointed out, the right to tax Bengal, and some of this went to the emperor, but some went for profit. It's been said that the company taxed too heavily, and I'd agree with that. But who's ever complained their taxes were too low? People always say their taxes are too high. They certainly do in modern India. So it's important to know that the company only owned or held land in India by purchasing it or renting it from Indian rulers. So can't say that it wasn't with consent. Obviously, it's a completely undemocratic era in the United Kingdom as in India. Well, at least the UK had some sort of parliamentary government. But anyway, I know sort of lapse into narrative rather than analysis, and so some of it was bad. Okay, so what else was I going to say? So the India East India Company showed some sort of regard for legality, which I don't think can be said of every state at the time. Obviously, there are hundreds of them, so it's difficult to generalize. Anti-imperialist historians are so often guilty of horrific double standards, holding the British to the highest possible standards of legality and human rights, but not expecting any such standards of, say, Indian states. So there were famines in areas ruled by the company. This has caused horrendous suffering, just unimaginable to see people as walking skeletons. Deaths from malnutrition did not start with the East India Company. We just don't have reliable statistics before that. All we know is that the Indian population hardly grew for centuries, but once the East India Company came, it started growing in the late 18th century a little bit, and that speeded up through the 19th century to really rocketing by the mid-20th century. So this has happened all over India in areas ruled by the company, not ruled by the company. It happened all over the world at the time. This idea that everybody gets to eat is actually quite a new thing. Get enough to eat. In the 20th century, mercifully, famines became a rarity by the end. But you've got to remember the 19th century, from the rest of human history, they're actually quite common. Because technology wasn't so great. We hadn't made so many discoveries about modern farming techniques, didn't have so much fertilizer and so on. It's after the British Raj, obviously, the high-yield varieties of rice came out for the Green Revolution. So the Mughal Empire became so feeble that Delhi was sacked by the Afghans in 1739, fellow Muslims, carrying off the peacock throne. People often say that the British Army and the Indian Army under the Raj existed only to protect the Raj from its own subjects, which is manifestly bogus. The Afghans have been raiding deep into India for centuries, but they were never able to do so. Once the British came, the Afghans attacked, but they were kept in the northwest frontier. They weren't getting near the Indus. So that's why some Indians would have been grateful to have this mighty ally to help them defend themselves against the Afghans. And Indians often go, there's 3 Anglo-Afghan wars. Indian soldiers say, well, that's great because this is forward defense. Otherwise, the Afghans would be looting from us again. So, it was Seeley was the one, that 19th century historian, who said the British Raj was acquired in a fit of absence of mind. Some will say, how could you have this absence of mind? The absence of mind took a few centuries and ended up encompassing a third of the world's land surface. How could that have possibly taken place by happenstance? Well, to be sure, it was accidental in India in its early stages, but by the mid-19th century it was a conscious endeavour. It was sort of prancing proconsuls early on, of which London had little say, was always informed post factum. So the East India Company attracted people from the lower middle classes, enterprising sorts. It's quite expensive to get a job. You had to pay for a job. I remember in 1999 in Mumbai, people saying they had to do the same thing. So people had to sign on as a writer, which was really a clerk, and sail for like 8 months quite easily to India. Malaria and tropical diseases often carried people off, killed them very quickly. But those who survived could secure a good social position. And if they went home with a fortune, they were loath to risk their lives in India a second time. So the East India Company was governed by shareholders as the General Court of Proprietors, and they held, then there was a large number of people. Then there was the Court of Directors, an elite inner circle of very wealthy people who owned lots of shares, and they made the decisions about the East India Company. So the British Parliament empowered the company to make decisions about the land it's governed, to do justice, to make war, and to make peace. And the East India Company even founded its own navy. Sometimes the East India Company would be a war against an Indian state, but the United Kingdom itself would not. So by the late 18th century, the British Army was there as well, not just the East India Company's army, the British Army. So the company became increasingly important to British political economic life, and that's why His Majesty's ships and His Majesty's soldiers were there. People said they were working for John Companies to strike it rich, but they often returned and got into politics. That's why they're called Nawabs, those British politicians who made it good in India. So after the Muslim Indian title Nabob, we used to call them Nabobs. The best known example is Thomas Diamond Pitt. He got this sobriquet because of the diamond of prodigious price and size that he'd sold, acquiring his staggering wealth. Diamond Pitt, he founded the political dynasty, the Pitts, the two prime ministers, Pitt the Elder, Pitt the Younger, being his son and grandson. So the 7 Years' War was principally a European conflict, and there were several countries on either side. From 1756 to 63, the United Kingdom on one side, France on the other. But it was fought chiefly in Europe, but also in other theatres, including India. So we come on to Robert Clive, who's one of the most famous figures associated with the East India Company. But anyway, this has gone on over an hour, so I will not carry on talking about that Shropshire lad, Robert Clive. So I'll sign off now and get into more detail later. Toodaloo.